It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. I'm the president of Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting. You can find a link to my work at emailrevealer.com. You can also get an autographed copy of my book there, How to Become a Successful Private Investigator. All kinds of asset searches and locates and adoption investigations. Emailrevealer.com. Okay, very excited about today's show. We have John MacLeod. He's the author of the book Behind the Wall of Illusion. And it's about the Beatles and about their religious involvement, their occult involvement, and all kinds of stuff we've always been fascinated about here at the Opperman Report. So we're really happy to get John MacLeod. He has a history of writing books about music. A couple, Phil Spector, Sound of the 60s. I'm a big Phil Spector fan, you know that. And the other one is Leaders of the Pack, girl groups of the 1960s and their influence on popular culture in Britain and America. Good old Ronnie Spector, man. I tell you, I can't listen to Ronnie Spector without singing along. So we got John MacLeod. Mr. MacLeod, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Ed.
Thank you so much. Tell the audience who you are. Who is John MacLeod?
John MacLeod is, he comes from Ireland, Dublin originally, but now in the last 10 years I've been living in the west of Ireland, County Limerick, which is, I suppose, very, very old country type of place. And I am a musician and a writer and written 3 books now on popular music and culture. And I also I lecture in the university here and in what they call the Further Education College in music, film, media, that kind of thing. So that's my background.
So when you describe it as the old country, is this like farm country?
Yeah, it's quite rural. Not so developed as what you might consider Limerick is a city. It's the 3rd city in Ireland, but it's just really a small street with a couple of shops and then a lot of countryside. The really big river goes through it called the Shannon, which is the biggest river in the British Isles. We get a lot of rain here, a lot more than they get on the Dublin side. We're closer to you guys in America, and it's wet, but it's nice being in the country, you know.
Yeah, I have a grandmother from Ireland. Yeah, my grandmother grew up on a farm in Ireland. Now the website to get this book is called LimerickWritersCenter.com, and
the Limerick Writers Centre, which actually was originally kind of funded by a guy called Frank McCourt, who is quite well-known author, very big in America. He wrote a book called Angela's Ashes.
Oh, sure, okay.
Yeah. So the Limerick Writers Centre has a kind of a bit of a history in trying to promote, I guess, culture here, and particularly, the written word here in Limerick. So that's why I was kind of interested to see what would happen if I kind of went with a local kind of collective like the Limerick Writers Centre. So if I brought this book to them, I was curious to see how that would work out from the point of view of sales, promotion, and that. Just working with a collective rather than a big publishing company, which is what the other 2 books were with.
Yeah, and the book is called Behind the Wall of Illusion, and people need to be aware it's not available on Amazon, so you have to go to this website, Limerick Writers Centre, and center is spelled the old English way, C-E-N-T-R-E, not the American way, the way we spell things, C-E-N-T-E-R. Okay. So what can we find in this book, Behind the Wall? It's about the Beatles, right? And they're religious and occult. Yeah, so what did you come up with?
What did I come up with?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose one interest of mine for a long time has been with philosophy, which my degree was in English and philosophy, actually. And when I left university, I kind of came across kind of a philosophical view of a guy called Rudolf Steiner, which people in America might know him through the Waldorf education or Steiner schools, things like that. He's kind of mostly known for that, but his interests span across every conceivable topic, from farming to beekeeping to drama to music to religion to etc., etc. So he became kind of a big influence on me, and I suppose it's really a way of kind of seeing and living in the world. In a movement called anthroposophy, which means the wisdom of man. So kind of looking at ourselves, looking at how the human being is, how it works in the world, and that is a kind of a blueprint for how things, in a sense, should work in the world. So that's how society should organize themselves, etc. So this became a kind of big interest to me, as the Beatles were since when I was a kid. So they kind of opened up a door to me in relation to music. And that kind of led into, what John Lennon was reading, or what other groups at the time, that I got to know through the Beatles were what was influencing that culture. So that kind of led me on a road into literature and philosophy. And so it's kind of bringing all that, I suppose, that whole background of mine together that this book it does. And I guess, the 60s were a huge time when there was, tremendous changes culturally. And I think from the perspective of Rudolf Steiner or anthroposophy, they would kind of see, well, what were the things behind these cultural changes? What, in a sense, spiritual forces were activated through those cultural changes? And of course, the big one to start it off was World War II, because that in itself is a spiritual act that's manifested itself on the planet, and so it changes the whole nature and the whole fabric of society afterwards. And I've always been kind of interested then in looking at, where my own culture, my own growing up in the 80s, that period, obviously, what came from that, and where did that come from? Which I guess, the 60s, 70s, 80s, leads into that. So trying to get an understanding more of the time I'm living in and the culture I'm living in. And from those perspectives really influenced me, the Rudolf Steiner one and the Beatles and things like that. So I think the 60s was very much a time of change, and very much once the war had ended and all the things that started to change, it kind of flowered from my perspective in the 60s. And so a huge cultural revival, I think, like a kind of a mini renaissance. And so with that, obviously, of course, comes, kind of you have a new way of thinking, a new kind of religion, in a sense. And I think one of the main aspects of that new culture was this kind of youth culture, which brought with them, I think, rock and roll and cinema and all these kind of popular things that we take for granted now, in a way, were suddenly exploded, with Elvis, and then I think found their kind of biggest expression in the 60s. But that was kind of a religion, I think, to young people. It was something that they found more could express their way of life. It meant more to them. They were kind of closer to it. They could participate in it. They could trust it more so than maybe the more established religions, particularly in America and Britain and that at the time. I think they kind of lost faith in those institutions. So rock and roll kind of came to replace it. So from that perspective, the book starts with the Beatles growing up in Liverpool, embracing this kind of new religion of rock and roll and popular culture. That was the first thing I felt.
Sean, before we get too far ahead, you described World War II as a spiritual act. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think, it's like if somebody goes through a crisis in their lives, it's something that we can see as something at the time is very dark, isn't it? You have a personal crisis, maybe you lose somebody close to you, or you're just in a very difficult situation, and it can really just happen. I think one minute everything's fine, and the next thing, your whole world can be turned upside down. And I guess these are kind of doors opening, or something has been. There's a change, there's a shift going on, and sometimes I guess we don't make it through those crises, but more often than not we do. And when we come out the other side, we're kind of glad they're over. But I think when we look back on them, we realise how much we've grown through them. And so to me, that's the kind of a spiritual development of the human being. Your own individual biography has many of those in it. And if people don't have them, I think, they're either not really they're not really paying attention to what's going on in their lives, or, they're very necessary. So each country has them as well. I mean, obviously America had quite a number of them. The Irish have had a lot of them. Every country has them. And so the world, I think, has had them on globally, a collective, experience. And World War I and World War II were definitely crises that the whole world was facing, and out of which something changed. And I think what changed there was, mostly was this sense of freedom. Freedom was one of the things that developed out of that. Freedom of expression, personal freedom, freedom that was fought for through those wars. Freedom, for example, we had in Europe, freedom to travel came out of that. We can travel anywhere in Europe now. The nation states began to kind of loosen, and Europe became a big state, like in a way America is. But before that, you couldn't cross borders. That didn't happen until the 70s. But that grew out of certain treaties and pacts that came out of World War II. So it led to a lot of things, that were a revival, not a revival isn't the right word, but a kind of a resurrection of things in a sense. Something new happened, and I think one thing that really happened was youth. The youth suddenly became, we suddenly had a youth. We suddenly had. You didn't go from being a kid to being an adult at the age of 18. We now have this period of finding ourselves, in a sense, and of like giving ourselves time to think about things. And we don't go. We're not like, we have that space, and that is something I think the youth suddenly had a voice. I think as well, But at the same time, there's a negative side to that. I think where it kind of gets a little bit manipulated, and that's something I think that I look at in that book as well, that aspect of things.
Now, okay, I guess you could describe the World War II era as like a trauma. There was an international trauma to the earth, and everyone was like in shock over it, And then after trauma, we're often open to new ideas, or even open to mind control. We're open to manipulation. So do you believe that this new, like you said, this new renaissance, this new counterculture, this new thing, that we're having trouble describing, but this new thing, this thing in the air that was there with this youth counterculture and all this, do you think that was organic or constructed by some kind of overseeing manipulation?
Well, I mean, I guess this is my opinion. So it's just my own opinion on it is that. Well, first of all, sorry. This first thing I'm going to say is not my opinion. I think it's fact. If anybody just looks at the world and looks at themselves or anything, we do have, for want of a better word, we don't want to get into the semantics of things. We have good and we have bad. They are relative in that, as I said before, you could experience a crisis, something bad can happen to you, but that could lead to something good later on down the road. And often you read about people, of course, who've had a bad experience, but then they overcame that experience and it led them on to some kind of great, where they are today. And they recognize that was the moment that led them to that point. But So there is good and bad in a relative sense, and that's here. We experience it. Once we tell a lie, we can assume, well, that's not a good thing to do. We can lie to ourselves. We can lie to other people. So we can experience that in ourselves. We do that ourselves, and we don't need to look any further to recognise there is that duality in a sense of good and bad. So the other thing that I could say after that, which is kind of really my opinion in a way, but from looking at a lot of, spending a long time looking into these things, I think it's an opinion that is based on a lot of research and evidence that I've uncovered, and so I think there is this idea. If you look at a lot of things online, or particularly online, where you get a lot of this information, things to do with the 60s, to do with the Beatles, to do with the Tavistock Institute or mind control. I'm a bit skeptical about where some of those people are getting their information or where they're going or what the agendas there are. But I think there's a lot that suggests the whole thing is a mind control thing. The whole 60s, Renaissance was something like that. And I don't really buy that argument. I think, but what I do think does happen is, something organic can grow out of, so we have this trauma, as you said, or this spiritual crisis or this world crisis, the war, and things came out of that, which were technological advances, freedom. We had time, we had money, we had the sense that war is something that we really should try and avoid to all costs. So we have all of those things, and so like technology can be great, but then if it becomes like used in the wrong way, or if we create, for example, a consumer culture just to keep that going, and then that's manipulated by certain groups of people who want to make a lot of money, or they realize certain things have an influence on the culture, or they use advertising to penetrate your unconscious, and they things are, they have this power over us, which bypasses their own free will in a sense. So these are kind of negative aspects of that. But something organic grew out of World War II, and that is the fact that technology came, freedom came, these things came. So I think with the 60s counterculture, or whatever way you want it, or just the pop culture of that period, I think it was very organic and very positive in the sense that, if you look at those early groups, some people might think they're manufactured and things like that, but the sense of joy and, just the sense of being alive is something, it's very kind of young, innocent, nearly teenage kind of feel to it, because that's what it is, and that's the teenager kind of grew out of that. So it's no surprise that it's like that, and I definitely, in my book and the girl groups, I kind of talk about that. There's tremendous innocence from those girl groups, 63. Not completely innocent, but there's a sense of innocence, a sense of something new, a sense of excitement. The songs express that. There's no labouring over the writing of the songs. And I think that's the same with a lot of these early 60s groups, groups that came around in the early 60s. Just a kind of a freshness, a newness, a thing of something that it doesn't seem too laboured or too thought about. It just comes about organically. And I think if you compare that to music, popular music today, there seems to be a lot more. It's thought about a lot more. It's marketed a lot more. It's the manufacturing of it is very different type than it was back in the early 60s. And I think you can see a very clear progression of those people, those young people, that group, who are writing these songs, who were around at the time. They start to evolve and grow, and suddenly the music goes from being a very innocent teenage kind of very much about love and relationships, which is what teenagers find themselves in at that stage, at that early teens. It grows into something a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more introspective, and then that moves into something a little bit more kind of revolutionary and confrontational by the end of the 60s. and it nearly kind of charts the whole period of your teenage life, I think, you know. You start off kind of innocent teenagers discovering girls and boys or whatever, then you kind of get a little bit more, adolescence comes along, you get a little bit more introspective, and then kind of rebellious by the end of it. You know, by the time you're 16 or 17, you're wanting to leave home, or you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you have to emancipate yourself from your parents. You have to.
Looking good, feeling good, and making a world of difference, one bottle at a time. Care for your hair and the planet with Elvive from L'Oréal Paris. All our shampoo and conditioner bottles are now made from 100% recycled and recyclable plastic, except the caps, which we're still working on. Together, we can save 5,000 tonnes of virgin plastic a year. For more information, see l'oreal-paris.co.uk/Elvive Recycle.
Bell and separate yourself from your parents. We got to take a little commercial break here. We're with Sean MacLeod. The book we're talking about today is Behind the Wall of Illusion. Now you can get this book over at this website in Ireland called limerikwriterscenter.com. Sean, right before we went to the break, you were saying about how, and I hate to back up too much, but you were saying about how this idea that, because you hear these people talk about how the Beatles were created at Tavistock, right? And I've heard this so many times, and I've tried to look it up, and I had people come on the show and talk about Tavistock, but exactly, and you don't subscribe to that, do you?
No, so I guess not to the extent that a number of people do. I guess just to finish off what I was saying before is that certain things come about which are spiritual forces. You know, they're quite positive, very 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 active, very they're powerful, but they're positive spiritual forces. But of course, that always has its shadow side. And you might consider the shadow side. I mean, you might consider it to be, you know, by the mid '60s, you suddenly had a very, you know, you'd marijuana and you'd LSD and things, which changed the nature of the music. It changed the nature of personalities of those people making the music, and it changed the nature of the culture as well, particularly in the Western world, America, Britain, and those places. But that shadow side is very important as well, you know. The shadow side is something we need. It's part of who we are as human beings, because that shadow side allows us to look inward. It allows us to ask questions and then to challenge the things that we thought before. So that's what happened with marijuana and LSD. It became, you know, we looked inwards. But also caused an awful lot of destruction as well. You know, it kind of devastated a lot of the musicians, devastated, from what I could see, a lot of the culture. Young people were kind of got lost through the use of that. But also it created some great art, and it also created something that allowed us to kind of expand our consciousness and become aware of things beyond just the materialistic, mundane, everyday, consumeristic society, which America and Europe to a large extent were becoming. So it's the shadow side is necessary. You know, as the German philosopher Hegel would see it as, you know, with that there's a growth and something, a third thing comes out of that, something grows out of that. But also with that shadow side, I think, you know, there are they're in a sense forces that we're aware of around us. They're not necessarily brought about by one particular person or group of people, although sometimes that can come through those people, that those forces can come through those people, like I think it did with the Beatles. I think they were just a spiritual force was working through those four individuals together, you know. And I think they became more and more conscious of those forces working through them, and you can see how they, by the end of their career, are trying to nearly kind of work with those forces. I mean, they're aware of them, and they constantly talk about these things that, you know, the songs come from some other place, or you know, there's this kind of religious, esoteric aspect to their interviews after about 66, 67, which LSD brings, and their trip to India also brings that. But in regards to Tavistock and things like that, I think there are, just as the Beatles and the groups around that time in the mid-60s, late 60s, started to become more conscious of who they were, of what was happening, of how they were changing things, of where their music was coming from, and started to work with it on a more conscious level. I think there are groups of people that are aware of things that are coming down the line. They're aware of what they need, what needs to be done to change, to how do you say, guide those things in order for certain results to come about that are favourable to those groups. So that's a negative thing, in my opinion, because it's consciously manipulating things in a way that is not often done with the awareness of the people that they're trying to manipulate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
So there is quite a large and quite, I think, substantial amount of evidence to suggest that though this LSD culture kind of flowered, and it seemed to be a natural evolution from, if you can imagine, where could the Beatles go after the first initial years of Beatlemania and the mop top and stuff like that? I mean, it had to go somewhere else. And when they met Bob Dylan and he introduced them to marijuana, and you suddenly had this emergence of rock and roll or pop music with this kind of folk, thoughtful, intellectual type of lyric. And suddenly you got a new whole type of genre of music. So you can see that, I think, with the Beatles when they move into their rubber soul, their kind of maybe Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver period. And then that accelerates into LSD because they're suddenly aware of a different state of consciousness with the marijuana. And then somehow into the culture creeps LSD, and it's given to them, the Beatles, by accident. So there's a kind of an organic thing in a way that happens and accidentally enters into their life. Now, they were given it by a particular individual who may have done that on purpose, to kind of get them interested in it. But they did absorb it into their music, and then that led the music to go a different direction. And it led, because they were kind of leaders of the 60s culture, that led into the culture and other music like Hendrix or later Pink Floyd and stuff, this kind of psychedelic period. And so, etc. So it's an organic growth. But I think somewhere along the way there seems to have been groups of people who were aware of things that were happening. Definitely with the LSD, there were a number of people behind introducing it into the culture for very particular reasons, which seem to be quite nefarious as far as I can tell. So in the book, the title of the book with, the religious, occult and esoteric world of the Beatles, I kind of use that word occult, even though it's not the right way to use the word occult, because the occult really just means things that are secret, But I think if things are kept, in this day and age, if things are kept secret from people, it tends to be not so good, because we're in a period of where we should be more mature and responsible about things. So keeping information from us is like keeping, it's okay to keep information from children because it might harm them. So I think occult schools in the past kept information from us when we were maybe not, in a sense. So, we're in a democracy now, the world of democracy, which means we can take part in our own governance. So we've been given that responsibility. So keep things secret from us anymore. It's not really, we're not in that cultural period anymore. That was something from the past. So it's like a child becoming an adult. You don't keep secrets from them, or you tell them, silly things that aren't true. You have to tell them, you have to give them the facts and let them make up their own mind about it, in a sense. But that's another issue, because we're also in a culture where we're not being taught anymore. I really feel we've been taught not to think, even though we have this ability to think and we have freedom to think, and we're supposed to be told to think and learn how to think. In actual fact, we're kind of being denied that a lot through many different forms. And there seems to be a suggestion that LSD was a kind of a start to really disaffect people's ability to think. And there is I think there's some truth to that. So I know I'm kind of rambling on.
No, not at all. But I have a couple of questions for you. I have a couple of questions. One is because you say that we should have access to both sides of that we should have access to occult information and make up our own minds. But the thing is, if we're told in the Bible, that we shouldn't be dabbling in this kind of occult behavior and this kind of stuff, And there's nowhere that we're allowed to in media and news and stuff like that. Nothing from the Bible is ever taught anymore at all. We're only being taught now the other side.
What other side?
The occult side. Do as thou wilt. It's promoted. Yeah.
Well, what's the question you're asking me? Do I think that's true or?
Yeah. What do you make of that? Like, because you were saying that you think it's okay that we're adults now and that we should be exposed to this occult information. But if we're not also exposed to information from the Bible telling us not to dabble in these occult activities, how can we make a fair decision as adults?
Well, again, I think for me, the word occult means that again we're exposed to in this idea. For me, the word occult means secret. It's secret knowledge. Right. It doesn't mean anything dark or black. It's kind of become to mean that, and I do use that word occult in those terms in that book. And I use the word esoteric to be more something, some of the spiritual phenomena or something that is behind the world that we live in, and that could be, we look at a plant and we see a plant and it looks a certain way, but the esoteric spiritual knowledge behind that plant really requires you to study it and look at it really, spend a lot of time, like the German poet Goethe would have done, and to really feel that in your, you nearly become one with the thing, so you can really understand it. But so this idea of dark, of occultism in a dark level, in what we might call left-hand path kind of black magicians, if we want to use that term, if we want to use occult in that term, that's true what you're saying. I think we're only being told certain things, and it's actually from, I think, left-hand black occultists that are working in the media, are working throughout, many areas. And so an advertisement on TV, it's that simple. An advertisement on TV that kind of brainwashes you into buying something because it's bypassing your free will in a way. That is a certain kind of black magic, I would think. Smoking cigarettes, everybody knows that kids are naturally not drawn towards cigarettes. And when you get older, when you're in your late 20s, 30s, you tend not to be interested in those things if you haven't already started them. So that's not the case for everybody, but it's generally the case. So the best place to get people hooked on cigarettes, which I'm sure cigarette companies know very, very well, is when you're a teenager, because that's when you really start to smoke. That's when you're impressionable. So even though it's illegal to sell cigarettes, it is in this country anyway, to people under 18, the cigarette manufacturers know that that's the age they need to entice them into smoking. Otherwise, they don't have a potential market, for later on, for the years later on, when all the smokers that have passed on, they need the next generation to smoke, and they need to get them at 13 or 14. So they have to use, despite all the warnings on cigarette packets that you have here and the kind of graphic images that they have, and say they know it doesn't work because that's not where those people, that's not where you capture somebody. You capture somebody in their feeling life. They feel like a cigarette. You don't think about having a cigarette. You feel like one. So trying to access them, trying to tell them stuff in their head is not going to work. So it's a kind of a game because they're telling you we're giving you a warning and stuff, but at the same time, that's not the area that's going to affect their decision making in regards to smoking. It's a feeling,
right? Because they're not making it glamorous and not to smoke. They're not making it jingles and romantic not to smoke. They're not appealing to those kind of emotions to cause us not to. Yeah.
So they appeal to emotions, and I think you get the same in a lot of industries. They appeal to the emotions. They bypass the thinking aspect of the person, and that's the aspect that's free. We're free to think our own thoughts, and we're mature enough to be able to make those decisions. So, for example, we had an abortion referendum here in Ireland. We haven't had it where it's illegal in this country, but you might have heard it was passed yesterday on Friday. And I think that was a campaign really where, that wasn't really the yes vote wanted to be passed. There was an agenda that's been set off quite far down the road. But in order to get people to think that they're thinking for themselves, they have to make them think that, well, I'm voting freely out of my own, ability to think for myself, etc. But I really don't think so. I think a big problem we have, just like you're talking about today, is we use a lot of things to manipulate people into thinking that they need to think like this. So, for example, human rights might be one. They're labels that are put on things to make people think that they're thinking for good causes,
right?
Or for in a good way. You go often get this, what they call the pincher effect, where you might hear of the kind of Hegelian system where problem, reaction, solution. So they set up a problem, and then they react. There's a reaction to it, and then they come in with the solution. So they've kind of manipulated the people to cry out for the thing that was there at the beginning of the whole agenda. They public relations, or, well, do you know what I mean? So I think that in that sense, these occult groups were possibly behind certain aspects of the 60s. There are lots of groups behind it, in the sense of there's people out to manipulate the Beatles and that culture for money. There's people out to manipulate it for their own personal prestige. There's people out to manipulate it for deeper reasons, because they want culture to go a certain way. And I think the Beatles were very, very. I definitely think Lennon and Harrison were very in tune with that at some point, which is why they got very disillusioned with being Beatles and being manipulated in many ways. And I think there's quite enough evidence that shows that, in terms of their comments on being Beatles or that period of their life. Harrison, before he died, became a supporter of what's called the Natural Party, is that what it's called? Which basically was, he said, to make people become more conscious of themselves and more conscious of the world they live in, which, of course, he said, is not what politicians want people to do. So, they don't want us to become very conscious of what's going on, in a way. So it's easier. So they were quite aware, I think, of those forces there, behind in certain aspects of their career or their life.
Yeah. Just the other day, I was listening to Breakfast with the Beatles. We have it here every Saturday and Sunday morning. Many stations play different versions of it. Breakfast with the Beatles. And they were playing these clips, and it was right after they had broken up. And they were asking John, would they get back together? And he says, well, now we didn't have any control back then, and now that we've gotten away from that and we have more control, maybe we'll get back together. So he described this, they're not having any control back then. Now, certain things, and you talk about this, like almost like a spiritual, driven force, propelling the Beatles. But early on, even in the album Help, they're standing there with their body positions. Aren't those Crowley type language? Like Crowley would teach that, to stand in those kind of positions?
Yeah, I've come across a number of things, and I do mention that in the book. There is the semaphores. Yeah, so they're also. They seem to look very like certain gestures that are used in, or at least Aleister Crowley shows pictures of in some of his books. But I think there's a few things there. And in the film itself, Film for Help, there's a lot of esotericism in it. There's this whole Indian thing.
Right.
And there's a real negative reaction, funnily enough, to India, to this what you might call esoteric knowledge coming from the East, which in a way there's wonderful knowledge there, but whether it's right for the West or not in this time is a different thing, and whether there was forces, which I do mention in the book, and which certain people have pointed to, that certain Eastern traditions that are not necessarily healthy for the West were brought in very specifically to disrupt and to cause confusion and chaos within the West and within our consciousness. I think it's possible that these things got into the work, but I think you have to look at, first of all, artists. There was photographers who took the pictures. There was other people around them that were kind of interested in these things and may have influenced the Beatles, and most definitely did influence the Beatles in how they interacted with these things like Crowley or the occult or just artists in general and philosophers and other writers. These people introduced them to lots of things which they needed to do in order for them to then expand and have things to think about and talk about and think about. And Crowley seemed to be one of the things that was kind of interest to the counterculture, particularly in Britain and to some extent maybe in America. As was Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, as was other kind of science fiction and kind of mystical works. Alice in Wonderland was obviously a big influence because Lennon had been influenced by that whole tradition of Victorian fairy tales and that kind of thing from his childhood. And so whether they are specifically dabbling in the kind of occult magic of Crowley themselves, I find it a bit hard to. I don't think that that's the case. There may be others around them that were using the Beatles there to plant certain things, and I think that's more likely. And then, in that sense, the Beatles were not free to be totally in control of everything they did. But the reason why I say I don't think the Beatles were so influenced by, we were so consciously involved in that whole thing, particularly around that period, is because, first of all, they were very busy writing songs, they were very busy touring, they were very busy making films, they were very busy doing interviews and other things. I just don't know how they would have dedicated so much time to really getting to know Crowleyan magic or other types of magic. I think it's something you'd probably have to spend a long time studying and practicing. And I just don't think at that point in their careers, I mean, that's only around 65. So, they're only three, they're just on a roller coaster then. And I think, I don't think it's possible that they would have known too much. It's more probable that later on, after the Beatles, that they had more time and they were a bit more mature and probably could absorb that stuff much easier. And, they were only kids, really, then, running around. What were they interested in? Getting rich and meeting girls and playing their music. I don't think they were that interested in black magic or Crowley or anything at that point. But there were maybe people around them that allowed those influences to creep into the music. And therefore, once it's there in the culture and very much in popular culture, then it maybe kind of starts to exert an influence. But I don't think, there's a lot made about Crowley, and I think Crowley is, I'm not saying he's not a negative influence or something like that, but there's certainly much darker occultists than Crowley around, Crowley was really someone who had an interest and dabbled in those things. But I don't think he was really, really that adept as some people, others maybe would have been, who we probably won't even ever hear about because that's how adept they are. They're very much in the shadows. But I think Crowley very much was, he was seemingly a secret agent for the British. So, he was someone who was, involved in lots of things and interested in lots of things and certainly did have an influence on popular culture. But, I think there's a lot more made out of it than there actually was. And his appearance on the Sgt. Pepper's cover, I think is, again, from what I've come across, there's some debate over who put it on the cover. But it's more likely it seemed to be a choice of Lennon's, who did it probably to just annoy people, more than anything. Lennon is definitely a very clever fella, and he's very artistic, but he's very much in his head, I think. It's ideas that he likes to know about and play with. For him to spend time trying to figure out how to cast spells or do things like that, I just don't think he had that temperament and that discipline to do that. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I know what you mean. You know, I had May Pang on the show, and she described Yoko. She was hesitant to get into it. But she described Yoko.
I heard that show, Ed, yeah.
Oh, you did? Yeah. So she described Yoko as being a witch, you know. Did you listen to my shows with A.J. Weberman, too? Because I've known him since I was 17 years old, and he used to hang out with John and Yoko in the Dakota.
I could have. You hear so many shows, but I know the May Pang one very well because I was kind of interested in it when I was researching stuff on the book. But there's questions over. I mean, well, I've come across a number of people from their early career, people they met in Germany, up to people that they knew after their life, after the Beatles split, all who seem to have been connected somewhat with witchcraft, black magic,
right,
things like this. But again, I think it's there's people are. I mean, Marianne Faithfull, who was obviously around in the '60s, girlfriend of Mick Jagger, and also had a bit of a pop career. Herself and Brian Jones's girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg. I mean, they were like, at least on some superficial level, interested in those things, that area, occultism or witchcraft or something. But that was the kind of spirit, as Marianne Faithfull said, that was the spirit of the 60s. You were interested in those things. You were kind of expanding your mind, you were looking beyond. Well, I mean, and let's not forget, the church on every level it's an occult brotherhood as well. I mean, and I don't mean that as in Jesus Christ or Christ, who's very important for me, particularly in my own life. There's a lot of stuff, and anybody who spends any time reading the Bible can realize that it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of trying to get to, it is so rich and deep with meaning that I'm sure, and then people have different interpretations of things, and some people don't like it. I mean, it's the big problem with Catholics and Protestants here in this country. They don't like each other's interpretations of things, and one person thinks the other is the devil, and so but they're both drawn from the same source. I mean, that is an occult text in the sense that it's an esoteric text. It's full of knowledge beyond what I think. It's the creation of the whole universe is in it.
Yeah, I believe that the Bible's like it's living and breathing. It's filled with the Holy Spirit, and you could read the same thing 2 days later, and it'll affect you in a different way. You'll learn something new. This might be a good time. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a living, as Jesus says, you came to me, I would have given you living water. It's living. It's constantly alive. And therefore, I wouldn't like to say we have to adapt it to the times we're living in. But if it becomes the word, when the word gets written down, I mean, Johnny Rotten said in one of his songs, the written word is a lie. Because once it becomes written and it becomes stuck, then it in a sense it becomes a lie. Because if it doesn't change, we don't change with it as a living thing. The word, Christ is the word, and the word is something I speak. But once I write it down, then it can become a dogma, and then it can become. And I think sometimes when it becomes a dogma, sometimes and in some senses, we might see that gets into the hands of people who can then use that for their own means. We have to really be awake to that. And I think when you waken up, and I think it's an interesting thing about the Beatles, is I think once they started to wake up to what was going on, then they started to disintegrate because they were very much aware, I think, of, as you said, they had no control. What they were being used by people. They were becoming kind of unhappy in the situation. It was becoming claustrophobic for them. So once you wake up to the situation, and then when you wake up, you realize, which I think, again, the Beatles did, once they had, fame, which they wanted in Beatlemania, which was great when it came because it just brought so much joy and excitement and newness to a bunch of kids, who had grown up, or had grown up in the aftermath of the war, and but at the same time, it brought a mania, and it brought people became out of control, and people started to look to people like Lennon and that as some kind of saviors, which, at the end of the day, they're very talented, very interesting, and possibly are conduits for something higher. But they're not the Messiah, So this is a negative aspect to Beatlemania, and but I think once they realised that fame wasn't exactly what they wanted, once they realised that they had all the money that they could, that they suddenly were making money for lots of people, including themselves to some extent. They started to realize people wanted them to make money out of them. So the wealth wasn't enough. So then they turned to LSD and to mind expansion, and that wasn't enough because that's a dangerous path to go down in many ways. And then they got into spiritualism and Eastern religion, and I think that awoke in them. And I think again a crisis point in Lennon's life when his life was threatened by that remark he made, they were bigger than Jesus. I think that brought him a greater awareness to this whole idea of Christ and love, and do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
They started to wake up, and I think the culture started to wake up as well. And I think possibly these dark occult forces maybe wanted them to wake up too soon. Maybe wanted them to kind of wake up in such a sense that it was just overwhelming for them. Maybe they on another level, it sounds a bit contradictory. Maybe they didn't want them to wake up. They wanted to kind of destroy them. The culture, because I think it's a very rich culture and a very, very, once you start talking about love in any real sense, which I think the 60s tried to do, it tried to, it didn't succeed, but it tried to. And then you're really shaking the tree of people who don't want a world full of love. It's much more profitable to have wars going on everywhere.
Did you look into Paul's friendship with William S. Burroughs?
Yeah.
What'd you come up with there?
Again, I think that friendship is, it wasn't from what I came across, it wasn't anything of any real depth. Because you have to remember, these guys are off touring a lot, they're in the studio a lot. So their lives are on the road quite a lot of the time. I mean, I know by 67 that had kind of stopped, but up until that time, they were just so busy. And as Lennon said, while everyone else was goofing off during the 60s, they were working 24 hours a day. So I don't think they had really time to kind of to have these very, to build up any kind of real deep relationships. But I think that comes more through McCartney's connection with the Indica Gallery,
right?
Which is an interesting thing. I think people should maybe look more at those things, because the Indica Gallery was a group of people. I'm not sure if your listeners know, but they were, they were writers and artists. Two people, particularly a guy called Robert Fraser, who was a kind of impresario. He was an art dealer. He would very connected with people, and he was friendly with McCartney through a guy called Barry Mills, who was McCartney's biographer actually later on, and that was through Peter Asher, who was friends with Barry Mills, and through Paul was dating his sister, was his fiancée, Jane Asher.
Right.
So there was a connection there, and their interest, from what I gather, is they were kind of intellectuals, and at the early 60s, they kind of wanted to bring about a kind of a counterculture that was based on a dream that Carl Jung had, where he saw kind of the new era, the new culture being. He had a dream apparently, and he saw this. It was basically this new culture would be in Liverpool. I think he saw it as this kind of counterculture, alternative culture, artist-based culture. But they kind of wanted to be the ones that initiated that. These intellectuals in the Indica, what became the Indica Gallery and Indica Bookstore, and but they wanted it to happen in London. So they kind of promoted that. So here again is a kind of an organic connection between, obviously, Paul meets Jane Asher. Jane Asher is from a family very kind of upper middle class in a way. The father was quite a well-known doctor, I think, and the mother was a music teacher who actually apparently taught George Martin, the Beatles producer, clarinet when he was younger. So it's strange that these connections are still there, and Paul somehow meets them. Jane Asher was an actress, and he met her at some show. They started to go out together. He gets to know the brother well and gets to know. So these links are organic. They're not created by the Tavistock Institution or CIA or MI5 or anything like that. They grow organically, but it just so happens that this person these people he gets to know have this interest in kind of creating a type of a counterculture. They obviously see the Beatles with they're making an impact globally. So they're kind of excited that they can influence them. They had all most of the strange books that they would come across, and people like Burroughs or other avant-garde composers that they would introduce McCartney to. McCartney, I think, particularly was interested in hanging around with these people because he saw it as a way to get, good sources for songs and to get ideas. Very, very clever McCartney in that way. But he doesn't have the fire in the sense that Lennon would have, that kind of just, grit and edginess. So I think he also borrowed these things very much consciously to give himself some kind of, to make himself not seem as quite as boring next to Lennon. And I think Lennon was interested in that. There was fascinating stuff going on. But, Lennon very much a person who I think is in his own world and in his own head. And he would spend a lot of time on his own, doing his own thing. And I think he had always done that from a young age. So McCartney was real social, able to keep all these ideas and bring them back to the group. That was his kind of contribution in a kind of, in really becoming an artist rather than just a pop musician or pop singer. Whereas I think Lennon's came more from himself and his things that he was interested in as he had always been as a child, the books that he read and the imagination that he had, and also the quite difficult life that he had, without kind of losing his parents and that kind of thing, which brought us kind of an inner artistic, expression. So I think McCartney's association with Burroughs is really only it's connected to those people, but I don't think it went any deeper than maybe he met him a few times and they shared a kind of some they had chats about certain things, but I don't think it went any further than that. He borrowed some of the techniques from Burroughs when they were using tape loops and stuff like that,
Yeah, the reverse stuff. He said that Burroughs was teaching him how to play stuff in reverse. Now, what about the connection between the Protestant Church of the Final Judgment and the Indica Gallery and McCartney and stuff like that? If there was this kind of an influence, like a thread of this influence, don't you think that they would be capable of pulling that off?
So who is that?
The Protestant Church of the Final Judgment?
Well, can you just tell me what that is? I'm not sure of what that is.
They were connected to the Indica Gallery and also to Burroughs. It's like a cult. It was a large satanic type cult run by the Grimson. They were based originally in London, associated with Charles Manson, associated with the Son of Sam murders over here. You're not familiar with that at all?
I think I came across something to do with that. All right, yeah. For whatever reason, it didn't lead me down any road to investigate. Not that it isn't worthy of it, but I don't know. I'm not so familiar with it, but I think I'm familiar with there's a site called Cult Beatles. The chap goes into that quite a bit, and all these various connections. But I found them to be, and I'm not saying that they are, I found some of them to be a little bit, I didn't find anything really substantial to follow. He also suggests there was connections there to the Beatles and the female scandal at the time, but I do see.
Wait, I'm sorry. What scandal?
There are these kind of strange associations, all right, because I know that McCartney was on he was one of the sponsors of the Monterey Festival, which is where Manson and a few other people, kind of pop musicians at the time, I think maybe it was Terry Melcher,
right,
Birds producing stuff, were going around handing out free LSD, and that was really where that whole LSD culture took off in the Monterey Festival. Now, the fact that McCartney's a sponsor of it, I don't know if that really means that, he was aware of them going around giving out LSD, and of course the famous interview he gives where he's asked, did he take LSD on TV, and he says yes. So this idea of promoting it, but there's lots of things you can read, I guess, into those things. And again, I'm just a little bit not sure of what a lot of these how powerful these groups are, or how. There's something a little bit not quite right with certain things there, and certainly, there's definitely the possibility that through the Beatles, and I think most definitely, these influences come. So, as I said earlier, the Crowleys, the signs of Crowley, or other things like that, creep in. But I don't know how conscious or aware the Beatles were at the time of that happening. But definitely, like anything, I think people were using them to influence culture in some way. So, they're the conscious forces. When I would use the word here, a cult, to me, the occult forces that found their way into the culture and into the mainstream through the Beatles. I don't think the Beatles were overly consciously aware of it at the time, during the mid-60s or that. I don't find that to be the case,
Yeah, it seems like John was oblivious to the influence that Yoko was having over him, and she was a devotee of hypnotism and all kinds of stuff, And it just seems like they were oblivious.
That Ed is, I think, there's all sorts of strange stuff going on there, and I do think that, and even the stories that they tell about. McCartney was interviewed on the what's this very famous American talk show guy that you have there, Lawrence Stern, is it?
Howard Stern?
Howard Stern
okay.
show. And this question comes up of, how did Yoko apparently says she didn't know who the Beatles were and she didn't know who Lennon was, but we know, and McCartney even says it in this interview, that he had met her first, and she kind of did know who the Beatles were, even though she had told John that she didn't know who they were. And I think that seemed to impress him, the fact that, here's somebody who doesn't know who I am and doesn't know anything about me. And in that sense, but so clearly, McCartney is telling us a different story to what seems to be the case, that she did know who the Beatles were. And McCartney suggesting that, well, she didn't, but at the same time, he let it slip that she did. And Howard Stern starts to probe into that when he slips up on it, when he just kind of seems to brush it away. So, but I think, again, that is it's a trait of McCartney's. He's a Gemini, and he's very the two sides of the Gemini figure. You don't know which side you're getting, so it's a kind of a slightly dual personality, and it kind of plays with you a little bit, I think, and plays with this. I think the Beatles author who wrote the book Shout, whose name just escapes me for the moment, but he he says McCartney, we can't ask McCartney anything about the Beatles because he doesn't tell. He tells you, he just lies. He tells you a different story all the time. And I think interesting when we go to the Paul is dead thing. There's a lot of stuff that I think from what I've come across actually since writing the book, which really confirm more that this is something that's been perpetrated to a large extent, I think, or to some extent, I think, I'm pretty sure of it by McCartney himself,
because back to Yoko, because her background is fascinating to begin with, because she was, she's a descendant of Hirohito. She's a very wealthy family in Japan, very powerful family in Japan. And that she escaped from a mental institution, and she's an escaped mental patient. There's no other way to say it. She was institutionalized, and she escaped from this mental institution. And then there was this whole other bizarre scenario with her children from her first marriage, that her and John tried to kidnap these kids. And the father of those kids had to go into hiding with another cult, by the way. We went into hiding for many, many years and is still under the radar and doesn't come forward and expose himself to any publicity. Just one bizarre, fascinating, as you start peeling away the layers of the onion on this whole story, it's just...
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of unsettling, and we're pretty sure from accounts of Lennon's assistant and personal assistant, is it Fred Seaman, who basically claims that the romance of Lennon, John and Yoko was not at all what it was, and suggests that they didn't really spend much time together, and most of the time it was Yoko doing business deals. And so again, we've been we've been sold some, again, PR thing, but which, there's always things that, we don't see either. So it's hard to you have to be careful not to jump too quickly to making up, to have too many assumptions. But that's, from what I can gather, that things on the surface, as it was presented to the public, were not what they were under the surface. I don't know if there's much more that I could say about that, particularly at this moment, because that's all I'm aware of. But there is some strange stuff without any doubt going on there between Yoko and Beatles and Lennon.
And it's compounded. It's
60s and beyond.
The secrecy is compounded because she's bought up books, she's bought up rights to books, and she's actually had people arrested for trying to publish material that they're aware of, claiming it was stolen material from her. Sean, now we've been talking about the Beatles' spirituality, their faith, and whatever. They were into Eastern mysticism, meditation. They went on a drug phase. What about and Dylan became a born again Christian, at least at one point in his life. What about the Beatles? Did they ever dabble in Christianity?
Well, I think so. There's quite a number of there's a number of references they have to Christ as a being, and I think Lennon refers to makes reference to from early on. I think from Rubber Soul, he talks about the word, and love. There's clearly an influence there, clearly something that interested him. I think, some people claim that Lennon wanted to be kind of guitar playing Jesus or that kind of thing, peace and love. I mean, I think, he's a human being, so it probably gets mixed up with lots of other things, and maybe kind of the drugs probably create some kind of delusional elements that were there, but that maybe manifested in him thinking he's some kind of, God or Jesus type figure. But particularly, I think they seem to reject the church and and what the church stood for in the early years. But I mean, you can't really blame them, because I mean, it was those institutions that brought the countries into war. So they kind of rejected anything from the past, and which is healthy in a way, rejecting things and then asking yourself questions. And then sometimes you find you go back to what it is that you rejected, but you come from it in a deeper understanding, or you revive it somehow. The next generation revives it. So I think himself and Lennon and Harrison particularly were. I think they were quite religious and Christian in a way. I think Harrison kind of got it mixed up a little bit with. He seems to me he kind of put it all into. It's all just a search for God. It didn't really matter what path you went down. That was what mattered. The search and the questions about why are we here and where are we going and what happens after death. And I think they are. That's work. If you're asking those questions, for me, you're on a good path to think there is something beyond just the here and now, and the materialistic world is not the be all of it. It's not everything. We're a spiritual being as much as we are a physical being. And but I think he seemed to mix them all up. And for me, Harrison seemed to kind of mix them up a little bit. And for me, there's dangers in doing that. It's a very kind of new age thing. But if you're asking those questions, it's better than rejecting it all. And I think Lennon. I think Lennon very much it's a personal thing for him. That's on God. He rejects all of these things. He rejects any kind of iconic figure, whether it's the Beatles or Dylan or Elvis or Kennedy or Taro or Buddha or Jesus. He says, he rejects them, and I think that's healthy in a sense as well, because the idea of Jesus is something that, as I said earlier, the Protestants here have one idea, and then the Catholics have another idea. So people hijack these ideas, these what become symbols or icons or something. They can hijack them and they can turn them into something that they're not. And I think what Lennon's answer to that was, well, you have to find the answer in yourself. You have to go into yourself and find the Christ within yourself. Whether Lennon put it in particularly those terms. But I have heard him saying in interviews, he's very Christian, a very religious fellow. Christ is something that means something to him. Dying is just like stepping from one car into another. So believe in some kind of afterworld. I think it's saying something like imagine where this idea of kind of a secular world, possibly, and I know people have used that to kind of, if we were all just living here in peace, it would be wonderful, and no religion. And maybe that's they're seeing that in a sense, particularly, I suppose, Christian type people. And maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what Lennon did believe. I don't think he's, I don't think he necessarily means that. I think he just means that people do abuse religion. It's tension, strife, and war, and
the connection's getting really choppy. We may have lost our guest. Let me see here. Did we? No, we still had a connection. Oh, you're back. Okay. You're getting a little choppy over there, Sean. Yeah, I think we lost it totally. Okay, you're back, Sean?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah,
you're a little choppy there. Let me ask you a question now, because I'd like to ask you a little bit about Phil Spector and about Ronnie Spector and the girls. But before we get to that, is there anything that's covered in your book that we haven't covered today that you want to sum up for us?
I think sum up. I was just thinking about during the outbreak. I think there's two things I'd like to say. One is I'd just like to go on to this Paul is dead thing, because there's an awful lot of stuff on the internet about Paul McCartney being dead, and I think it's a really interesting question in terms of why it's still there, why we still are certain groups of people are fascinated by it, and why certain things are coming out about it. from official places. And I think, there's a lot of that I've come across that would suggest, these clues or this evidence to supposedly, give the idea that Paul is dead. And, I don't want to say he is or he isn't in the sense of, it sounds a bit absurd, but, let people make up their own minds about it really. But a lot of the stuff that is presented as evidence is very quick to do a search and find that's just not the case. There's stuff like the Paul before 1966 much shorter, like 5'8", 5'9", and that later is much taller. In 1963, the first question they asked him was, "What how tall are you?" And he said,
Sean, you're breaking up so bad. Sean, you're breaking up so bad. I think I'm going to hang up and try and call you back. Okay.
Okay.
Try and get another connection. Okay. Yeah, we're with Sean MacLeod, and like I said, the book is called what's it called again? Behind the Wall of Illusion. Hopefully, we get a better connection because it's just a shame we're just missing so much of what he was saying there. Hopefully, Sean.
Hey.
So much better. Thank you so much.
Okay.
No, it's breaking up again.
Sure.
No, it's not getting. How about how about now?
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we're fine. Yeah, I can hear.
Okay, good. You sound much better. Now, you were saying about Paul is dead that so much of the information out there can be easily tracked down. And I'll give you one example right off the bat.
That you're gone.
You can't hear me?
Hello?
Yeah. How about I can hear you now?
Yeah.
Okay, so glad you were saying about how so much of the Paul is dead information could be easily disputed.
Well, yeah, as I said, like I just saw an interview not so long ago with Paul in 1963, and the first question they asked him was, "How tall are you?" And he said 5'11". And one of the pieces of evidence, for example, is that the Paul before 66 was much shorter. He was 5'9", or I think even 7. Somebody said, and then after he's taller, it's 5'11". Well, I mean, that's not hard to find. Stuff to show that he isn't. I mean, all the pictures before 66, he's the same height as the other two Beatles, who are both 5'11". John and George, who are 5'11". Ringo's always smaller than the others. I mean, it's just there's things like that are just they just don't have any weight. Same with things like the vocal range is much wider after 66. I mean, that's just not true, I mean, Lennon, McCartney's range is some songs, he's hitting fairly high notes. A lot of his backing vocals they're quite high. He's going into high A's and B flats and B's. I mean, the style changes in 67, 68, but the whole culture has moved from pop music into rock music. So you're going to get a lot more screaming and a lot more, these kind of high vocal yells that you get in the later part of the 60s as opposed to the earlier part. The songs are longer, everything's more intricate musically. So, yeah, he's going to be stretched. Everything is stretched. The solos are stretched. The playing is stretched. The songs are becoming more complicated. So I think there's a lot of stuff there that's very easy to dismiss. So it leaves a problem, which is a bigger problem, as to why there is all this. I mean, I gave a talk in the Hunt Museum here in Limerick when I was launching the book a couple of months ago now, and someone came up to me. I hadn't found anything really. There was one or two things at the time of writing the book that were still a little bit, I couldn't quite find an answer to, but subsequently I have found something. And so what it leads me to suspect is that there again, and this is again back to the cult, the dark side of this, cult agenda, is that we're really, I think, living in a world, as you probably know from having these shows and stuff, where the ability to discern between, information is just really doesn't seem to be there anymore. We just don't seem to be able to, we just hear something and we just go, oh, right, that's the case. And what's interesting about this Paul is Dead stuff is one of the books I have on it is by a guy called Nicholas Collerstrom, who has done a lot of research into areas such as 7/7 bombings in London and a lot of other kind of conspiracy type stuff, which is I found to be quite interesting and quite well, examined or researched. But when I read his book on the Paul is Dead thing, basically bundling it all into it's a CIA, operation, there's dark forces behind it, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the evidence he presents, you're just thinking, but this is just absurd. There's very easy, it's just not true. And he presents it in such a way that you can only see it as purposely misleading the reader. So that's a big question as to why somebody who is supposed to be trying to find the truth, in inverted commas, in other areas of political, social life, that we're not being told the full story through. But the point I'm making is this whole Paul is Dead thing, to me, is more interesting in that where, what's the ability for the general public to be able to discern between what is good, solid evidence for things and what's very flimsy, really unsubstantial evidence. And it seems they're more interested a lot of the time in the sensationalization of things rather than actually finding out what is, finding out proper answers to questions that really are based in some kind of logic. And I think that's a very interesting concern for the moment, because a lot of these things, I think, particularly with the internet and this idea of the battle for the fourth world, is it the battle for the mind or whatever is kind of going on now, and the internet very much central in that, I think is something to be very concerned about for particularly younger generation, who have come into this world and know, they're completely immersed in the internet, and that's, that only kind of came to me when I was an adult, so I was a little bit more prepared for the internet. But for the other generations, there's a lot of stuff going on the internet that's very difficult to know what's real and what's not real, and if it's affecting their ability to form logical, coherent, arguments, then that's a bit worrying, I think.
It seems like whatever bizarre story is out there, it creates like a baseline, and then every theory beyond that is trying to prove that one to be true. And then even after one argument after another is knocked down, they go right back to that baseline of the theory, and can never return back to the first step of what really happened.
Well, I think, that's a result of, what we might call, I suppose, postmodernism, and, people point to things like the Frankfurt School or, people like Foucault and Derrida here in Europe. And this whole postmodernist culture and this idea that, well, just everything's relative, nothing is true. Right. There's no way of, you can't really find any answers. So it's all just a big, whatever you want to believe is okay, in a sense. That's not that's not the view that necessarily they take, but the view that's presented there is everything's subjective and everything is like how you want to kind of see it. And but that leads down to, well, if I believe this, that's fine, and if you believe that, that's fine. And so it's not about trying to get to any kind of cohesive or coherent truth. And I think it's someone like Jordan Peterson or someone who's very much kind of arguing on the internet quite predominantly now that there is something, but this idea that, well, anything goes, you can do whatever you want and you can think whatever you want and stuff, logic or any of these things don't have a part to play in it anymore. It's kind of I think it could end up in a scary place to find yourself, because you're just totally at sea. And this could be linked back, I think, and some people have linked it back to the counterculture in the 60s and to, you know, the LSD period and to all of these things. And the Beatles kind of get blamed then for that. I think to blame them is not necessarily right, but I think some forces that then use them and manipulated the culture and things that happened even organically in the culture, but kind of got taken up in a kind of a negative way or whatever, are reused in a certain way to just kind of promote bands like maybe the Rolling Stones did with the occult thing. You know, I don't think they were particularly interested in the occult. It was just something that was popular at the time, and they jumped on the bandwagon. And as soon as it got a bit dark for them with the Ultimate concert and stuff, they dropped it like a hot potato, particularly someone like Mick Jagger. And so there's so many different things going on there, different threads of things going on that create kind of confusion. But one of them is, I think, you know, it's not necessarily the Tavistock Institute taking hold of the whole thing and controlling it, but possibly guiding things that have generated organically out of the culture, and they can see where it's going, and then they can kind of manipulate it. However, having said that, I do think that there are certain groups who, from my interest in esoteric things and not so much in the occult as in black magic, but interested in these figures that exist, or these left-handed, the dark brotherhoods, or as much as there are good, you know, groups of people out there working for the betterment of mankind, that, you know, I have come across things where people are aware of things that are happening or will happen quite a ways down the road. So it could be 20 years from now, it could be 30 years from now, it could be, you know, the whole idea of a new world order or a big brother, which, you know, has its origins back, you know, it's not just something that's happened in the last 10 years. It has a long trajectory. So it's possible as well that, you know, these groups could have seen things that might have happened, and through technology appearing, and, you know, race relations, particularly in America, the immigrants coming into the UK and stuff like that, that this whole thing would lead somewhere, and they were, you know, ready to take control of it or guide it in a certain way that suited their own agendas. I'm sure they have some knowledge of that. But I do think the seeds of it come organically. You know, they're not going to go, they don't know necessarily there's 4 guys over in Liverpool who are going to suddenly, but they're aware and they're ready for something like that to happen, and definitely aware that TV and radio is going to help to promote this thing, you know, whatever it's going to be. And that it could also be a flowering of some sort that would be allow people to become more aware of themselves and of have a better understanding of the world they're living in and things. So they know they have to be ready for that. And I think what the Beatles did, just to sum that up, is I think what they did was they came along and they changed something in the culture, brought some kind of greater awareness for those people growing up in that generation. And it also gives them the ability for young people to be able to express them, as I think in certain other things like cinema and that, particularly music. It could be something that, you know, very much you went and you studied music in a conservatoire, or you were from a family of musicians or that kind of thing. So I think with Beatles, groups like, so kids could just play music, they could find a way to express themselves. And that is, you know, they just needed to pick up a guitar. And like all these bands and stuff that formed by seeing the Beatles is a kind of a testament to that. And I think it's still very much the case, you know, a whole 30, 40 years of people making music or pop music or folk music, whatever, is still there because of that. And it's now at the point, I think, where people write their own music. It's definitely the case here, and it's very much, I know, the case in America and England and places like other places in this part of the world. So they make their own music. They develop friendships and relationships by doing that. They form groups and they go out and they play, and they explore a whole artistic expression and way of life that wasn't open to them before that. They make their own records. They record their own stuff. That's a big thing. And I think so they gave that to people. And by giving that to the people in a way, it kind of democratized the whole thing, like this democratization of what they call the music industry. So everybody can kind of go in the room. They express themselves through the song, and then they record it, and then they put it online, and someone else can hear that. So I think that's really a positive thing that the Beatles gave in that kind of cultural, musical sense. However, then what they also did is they created a mass music industry because they were so big and they made so much money for so many people, and they influenced so many people to go off, make records and make money and make all this that it created a business. And that business is kind of, and the business is more in many ways than music that's created. And that's kind of the negative side of things. So now we have people who are able to make their own music, express themselves to it, but they're sold this idea of being famous, being rich, or making it big, and so also have the means to do that. So you don't just have a guitar that you get for 50 quid anymore. You've got to get like really good electric guitar, and you've got to get an amp that, and you've got to get pedals, and then you've got to be able to go and record on some kind of recording device that's going to cost you money, and so it's a business that's being generated at the expense, I think, largely at the artistic side. The artistic side is lost there. So again, the shadow side seems to be overtaking the more positive side.
Sean, we're pretty much out of time, but can you give us a quick overview of the other two books about the leaders of the pack and Spectre? Like, what would we find there?
Well, the Girl Group book is, I guess I grew up listening to 60s music, and it wasn't until I think, I knew some of the girl group bands from Motown and things like that, Supremes and the Vandellas and the odd song from a few other groups. It wasn't until, I think, maybe it was like 12 years ago, that someone just gave me a copy of this CD by the Shangri-Las, and I listened to it, and I was quite blown away with how modern sounding songs were today, even for indie. And I started kind of hearing that influence on a lot of the music, particularly the male the music I would have listened to from the 60s. And I just kind of went out and find more music like that and found it to find it. I couldn't find anything on the groups. There wasn't any books really. There wasn't much in terms of stuff online. There was a few things I came across. And but the more I started to listen to it and, try to get the music from wherever I could, I just was really impressed with it. I thought, this is great. And these girls have kind of been written out of pop music history. So, I tried to follow that, took a number of the most important, significant groups, say, and I just kind of looked at them and their influence on the culture at the time. And I was really just wanted to look at their influence on the bands that I had listened to, but that led into, to the culture, etc. And then I was kind of fascinated with how that the girl groups in the 60s had changed and evolved into what they were, with Lady Gaga and I suppose from Madonna to Britney Spears to Lady Gaga, or the Spice Girls or the Pussycat Dolls or what, these kind of groups, and how there had been a huge change, I felt, a huge change in how, I guess how women have been presented, in the 60s, through the 70s, the 80s, and how women maybe behaved as regards that. And I'm kind of interested as to whether, again, there was some kind of manipulation involved in that. And so that's basically what that book is about, kind of a homage to the girl groups of the 60s and their influence on the other groups of the 60s and 70s. I mean, they were a big influence on punk in many ways. So it's kind of interesting. And then how also there was a change, and I think a much greater change for women and girls in music. The guys, it's kind of much more or less stayed the same. It hasn't changed too much since the 60s. Yeah. So that's what it tries to look at, how and try to see was that change manipulated more so by the media for girls than it was for guys, So that's that book. The Spectre book tries to just look at, I mean, the publisher asked me to do the Spectre book. They wanted it for their series called the Tempo series, which looks at popular artists in context of their cultural significance. And so I really just look at Spectre. I didn't really know what to contribute to that because there's so much on Spectre, you know, and but they asked me to do it, so I did it. And I tried to look at music more so than you know, his life in biographical terms. But the music, I think, very much, you know, just kind of, you can see how his life changes from, I mean, it's quite interesting in a way. What was interesting about doing the Spectre book is that I kind of knew his music from, and particularly from doing all the girl group stuff, because obviously he had a big impact in that genre. But a lot of the music I knew from Spectre, apart from things like To Know Him Is to Love Him and stuff, was mainly the girl group 60s stuff. Some stuff he did with the Ramones then in the 80s, and the odd thing he did with Lennon or the Beatles, obviously helping to tidy up the Let It Be album. But I only really realised he had done a huge amount before the girl group period. Like, I mean, just a whole load of music. Some of it's very good and some of it's not so good. I suppose the peak of it is that, you know, when he he creates the wall of sound, and he's got the crystals, and particularly the Ronettes, and this huge, you know, force in popular music. You know, really, it's hard to realise, I suppose, now, because, you know, you're looking back quite a long time, but, you know, a real force for about 2 years, which obviously, in one way, you know, was very influential musically on everything that was going on in pop music at the time. And obviously great for him that he could express himself and, you know, have this success, but also seemed to kind of totally ruin him at the same time.
Yeah,
you know,
it's incredibly powerful guy with a tragic ending. Speaking of tragic endings, we're out of time. So Sean MacLeod, can you give us an idea? How can people locate you? I know you got a Facebook page, right?
There's a Facebook page for me, Sean MacLeod, musician and author. That's where you'll find. I mean, I used to kind of do the Facebook thing and do all that, and I just kind of got a bit. You know, it really takes when you're trying to write books and write music, you find you're trying to on Facebook or on these social network sites trying to like promote what you're doing, and then you're not doing what it is that you are promoting. So I just don't really bother too much with that. I have a YouTube channel as well where people, you know, if they're interested in the books or what I have to say, my music kind of covers a lot of those themes as well. So I don't know where you'll find me. You know, you can go to the Limerick Writer Centre and you can get the book. You can get onto the Ed Oppenheimer show and you can hear the interview. But yeah,
okay, Sean.
Too much promotion, I guess, so much now. I just let the universe take care of that.
Sean MacLeod, you know, thank you so much. Okay, we're out of time.
To the God. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. Good night.